which is something we actually do all the time, many times a day. And it's something unique to our species. The next class, we're going to talk about physical time travel, which actually hasn't been shown can physically happen, but there's some wonderful theories about it we'll explore. But in this class, since we talked about emotional time in the last time, we're going to talk about emotional time travel today, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. So it's really about our memory. And memories are made through encoding in our brain. And there's not one single area of the brain that does that. It's actually many pieces of the brain, and they're jumbled together and fit in this neatly, like a jigsaw puzzle when it comes together and presents this cohesive memory to you. And so it's amazing that once you form the memory, it's stored. But then when you call it back up again, it's reconstructed. And what's amazing is it's actually regenerated every time in a new form with the new knowledge and the new feelings and the new experience you've had. So it's never quite the same memory every time you call it back. And in fact, it's probably missing some pieces of the original memory. So it really is an amazing tool, and it's this idea that it allows us to incorporate new information that's available to us at that time. And in fact, I've heard it described as almost like a Wikipedia page, which I love that concept. So again, instead of remembering the original event, that's why when two people try and talk about, oh, did you remember that? They might have completely different understandings of it because each one is filtering that experience through whatever knowledge they have now. And in effect, they're both right that that's their experience, and then maybe they're both wrong because that wasn't the original memory. So what really comes to that is that we're not just the sum of our memories, but really the masters of it, in that we can edit it as we choose. So I'll come back to that later, but it's an amazing skill. So there are actually numerous kinds of memory. We're going to talk today about episodic memory, but there's episodic. The two main ones are episodic and semantic. Episodic is about the feelings and emotions associated with certain events, and semantic is really much more about the factual elements of a memory. So let's say if you're at a wedding, episodic memory is going to remember how you felt when you were dancing with your loved one. It will remember how the taste of the cake and the champagne and how, just you were so happy. Whereas the semantic memory will remember the color of the bride's dress, and whether it was a chocolate cake or a vanilla cake, and what exact music was played. So they're quite different. But today we're going to talk about episodic memory, which includes both a prospective, which is the ability to look forward, and a retrospective quality, which is the ability to look backwards in time. And again, this is unique to humans, and allows us to do this traveling backwards and forward in time, which is what I mean by emotional time travel. So, as I said, when we call up a memory, we're creating dynamic representations of the past or the future in order to make sense of our world. And it's quite similar to the way we bring up the idea of the present, right? We call all of this information coming into our senses and build a cohesive story of the world around us so that we're able to react to it. And memory is basically the same thing. We're just calling up past experiences and piecing them together like this jigsaw puzzle. So the idea is, say, for example, if you remember your wedding day, it can change over time. What you remember of. In fact, I try and write certain things down so that I have a very clear memory of it, what had happened, and then I can look back on it later and go, oh, that's actually what happened. But this ability to call up events has both positive and negative effects. On the one hand, it allows us to formulate and store information critical to our survival. And a key element of this episodic memory is that it helped our ancestors to develop tools as well as weapons, leading generation after generation to improve them as needed, and helping to advance our civilization way beyond other species in the animal kingdom. So it also allows us to anticipate future outcomes. Say, for instance, how to plan if a hurricane is going to hit, like the one that hit in Louisiana, making sure we evacuate people in order to save lives. So it's been very, very beneficial. But this mental reliving of the past and projecting in the future has also been the root of many distinctly human dilemmas, such as the difficulty in moving on after a breakup, or the fear of failure, say, for a job interview, which often leads us to shortchanging our happiness, even preventing our success. So I listened to a talk by a well-known Stanford professor named Philip Zimbardo, and he says that we travel in 6 main time zones, and they are past positive, where you remember the good old times, and then there's past negative, where you're filled with regret and longing and sorrow. There's present positive, you're sort of in a hedonistic state, and in fact he says that's the way we're mostly born, as children. We just need to be satiated immediately. We need to be hugged. If we're crying, we need to be fed. And then there's present negative, where you don't plan because you feel like life is planned for you. There's future positive, where you're very hopeful and you think life will always get better. And then there's future negative, where you kind of have a fatalistic view of things. And as I said, we kind of start out as present positive in that hedonistic state, and then slowly but surely morph into one of those other time zones. So I totally understand why Philip Zimbardo says that, and I think there's a lot of truth to it. But I was wondering if in our mindfulness practice we can look at it through a different lens. So I know we concentrate a lot on being in the present moment in our meditation. And that's absolutely critical to achieving a sense of clarity and acceptance and understanding and being able to move forward. But I also think that in the real world, we can't simply ignore the past and all the history there. And we can't really, would be remiss if we didn't take into account that the future is coming and we need to plan for it. So I think keeping those time zones viable and available to us is important, but maybe we don't have to assign that positive or negative value judgment, because I think that's where we get into trouble with things. So it's that, as I say, it's kind of a devious habit that can be problematic. There are many examples of so-called bad situations that turn out to have positive consequences. I certainly think my accident is one of those. And, obviously there's the opposite, where really good things can turn out to be not so great. And you only have to look at some of the stories of lottery winners who, played the lottery for years, won millions of dollars. And in fact, it actually made their lives quite worse, if not outright ruined them. So we don't always know what is good or bad. And if it's possible to withhold that assignation of the value judgment, we may be able to be a little more flexible in our interpretation and dealing with things. So I'll give you an example from my own life. Last fall, I went on a silent retreat in upstate New York and was actually at an old monastery, so everything was very bare. And we weren't allowed to speak for 5 days, except in some group settings. And I was actually quite apprehensive about going. I thought I will be bored, or it just sounded a little, unpleasant. I'm a very outgoing person. I love communicating. I love meeting people. I love exchanging ideas. And so this whole concept seemed antithetical to really the way I live in the world. So the interesting thing was I found quite the opposite. So not speaking for 5 days was changed my whole perception of how I think about things, because I couldn't make a value judgment about people. I couldn't rush to judgment about what kind of person this person was by certainly not speaking to them, by being around them. I couldn't judge the food, I couldn't judge the teachings, because I didn't have anybody to share it with. And so I just absorbed the experiences and watched over time how my judgmental mind actually changed and morphed. And many times what I had thought in the beginning of the retreat was quite different from what I thought at the end. But because I hadn't actually voiced it, I hadn't, communicated that. It hadn't formed as a solid opinion in my mind. And I was much more open to allowing some different interpretation of the events and the people around me to take place. And so I think it's possible to withhold that judgment sometimes. And obviously there are certain cases where things are just obviously terrible. Obviously for right now, if you think about COVID, it's very, very hard to think about the positive outcomes here. But there have been some. We know that the air is cleaner and there's much less pollution, and gas prices have gone down because people aren't driving. People get to spend more time with their families. So everything does have pluses and minuses. But obviously, if you're going to lose a loved one, it's very rare that that's going to turn into a positive. But again, if we can withhold the judgment that locks us in to something that may have an interpretation to be different at some point in time, right? So that we form a memory that could be a slightly different version of it, and it could be a more positive one or negative one, but we haven't locked ourselves into a biased mindset, to a filtered mindset of, oh, now this is this, and everything has to conform to that judgment. So I think it's important, if we can understand our memory, like time, is precious, and we have the ability to curate it. Can we understand that all of our experiences, all of them, all of the time zones, all of what we consider good or bad, or is part of the fabric of who we are? And you may have heard of this person. He's been studied quite extensively. His name is Clive Waring, and he's a pianist who lives in England. And many years ago, he got some kind of a fever, a virus in his brain, and it absolutely erased all of his memory, all of his past memory, but also erased his ability to make new memories. In fact, he can only hold a memory for 7 seconds. And so, you know what he said? That it was like being dead, not being able to hold on to a memory. So our memories are so precious and so valuable. But again, sometimes they can make things quite difficult and unpleasant for us. So my thought is, can we live like entrepreneurs in terms of our memories, in terms of our mindset about things? And what I mean is, their most valuable skill is not a vision or a passion or this steadfast insistence on winning some prize or goal, but it's their ability to adapt an improvisational mindset, to be flexible, not merely about the route they are taking towards that goal, but maybe about the goal itself. So in terms of, let's say, our meditation, it's very easy to feel like we can't sit for very long, I'm not good at it, and we bring in, like, the last time I sat, I couldn't sit, so I won't be able to sit today. Or you have this judgmental mind, like, I should be able to sit for this long. And that kind of a mindset almost sets us up for failure. But if we come to sitting with a beginner's mind, like, we'll just sit today, and whatever happens, happens, that is the way that your meditation practice will flourish. And so the idea is, if we can remove this negativity bias, or even a very positive, like a future positive expectation, like it has to get better, but we can just say, I'm sitting now in the present, and I will sit again. I have sat, I will sit. That we end up opening ourselves to possibilities we might not necessarily think are available to us. The idea is, I know it's not easy, right? It's not, because it's just an automatic thing we do, but it's a concept, I think, that can bring us tremendous joy, because we're not attached to those labels of good or bad, especially within those time zones. And maybe if we can't stop labeling right away, at least we can understand that we perceive good today can change into its opposite tomorrow, and vice versa, and then be okay with that. So the idea, if we can travel with this flow of life, have this flexibility and adaptability, I mentioned in the last class that we are not stagnant ponds. We are like rivers. We're constantly flowing and changing. So can we flow and abide with time in that way, in our perception of time and our memories, and navigate through all the time zones and use them to our best advantage without assigning a positive or negative bias? And you just never know if losing, having a breakup with your boyfriend turns out to be the best thing, because you'll find the real soulmate. or that job you didn't get really wasn't the right job for you anyway, and now you have the possibility of getting a new job. But really just understanding things do change, and we should be able to flow with that change and allow that with a beginner's and open mind to accept that, and then make the best of all of those possibilities. So I wanted to quote William Shakespeare, who so famously wrote in Hamlet, and I think this sums it up. For there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So it's up to us to keep that open and beginner's mind as we travel through all those different time zones and allow us to live our best life. Thank you all. In the next class, we're going to explore some of the quantum theories around physical time travel, which I think you'll find quite fascinating and have a lot to do with our meditation practice. So thank you so much, and see you next time.